On the morning of July 2nd, 1937, a radio operator aboard the United States Coast Guard cutter Itasca heard Amelia Earhart's voice crossing the Pacific. Her aircraft was close. The signal was strong, but Earhart could not see Howland Island. She could not hear the ship clearly enough to obtain the radio bearing she desperately needed. And her fuel was running low. At 8:43 in the morning, the Itasca received one final message. Earhart reported that she was flying along a line of position running from 157 degrees to 337 degrees. Then her voice disappeared. No confirmed signal from the aircraft was ever received again. The Lockheed Electra never reached Howland. No verified wreckage was found. No bodies were recovered, and one of the most famous women in the world vanished with her navigator, Fred Noonan, somewhere over the Central Pacific. The official and simplest explanation is that they ran out of fuel and crashed into the ocean near Howland Island. But the absence of wreckage created a vacuum. Into that vacuum came stories of mysterious radio calls, a secret landing on a remote island, capture by Japanese forces, hidden photographs, human bones, cosmetic bottles, aluminum fragments, and sonar images from the ocean floor. Tonight, we will reconstruct the final flight minute by minute. We will separate the original records from the stories that appeared decades later. We will test the three most famous explanations: crash, capture, or castaway. And we will ask the only question that matters: what really happened to Amelia Earhart? By 1937, Amelia Earhart was already an international symbol. She had crossed the Atlantic alone. She had set aviation records. She had written books, spoken publicly, promoted commercial aviation, and encouraged women to enter fields traditionally controlled by men. Her final expedition was intended to become her greatest achievement. Earhart planned to fly around the world near the equator, following a route of roughly 29,000 miles. She would pilot a specially prepared Lockheed Electra 10E. Fred Noonan, an experienced navigator with a background in long-distance aviation, would guide the aircraft across the most difficult oceanic legs. By late June, she and Noonan had crossed the United States, South America, Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and Australia. They reached Lae in New Guinea, with most of the journey behind them. Only several Pacific legs remained, but the next flight was the most dangerous. From Lae, they had to cross approximately 2,556 miles of open ocean to Howland Island. Howland was not a large destination. It was a tiny strip of low land surrounded by a seemingly endless Pacific. From the air, it could disappear beneath cloud, sunlight, haze, or simple navigational error. To assist Earhart, the Coast Guard cutter Itasca waited offshore. The ship would transmit radio signals, provide weather information, create smoke during daylight, and respond if the aircraft required help. A runway had been prepared on the island. Fuel waited for the next leg. Everything depended on Earhart and Noonan reaching one small point after almost 20 hours over water. On July 2nd, they departed Lae. The Electra carried a heavy fuel load. The weather appeared manageable, though cloud and headwinds would complicate the flight. At first, reports suggested normal progress. But the Pacific does not forgive small mistakes. A slight error repeated over many hours can move an aircraft dozens or even hundreds of miles from its intended course. And as Earhart approached Howland, two separate systems began to fail her: navigation and radio communication. Noonan relied on celestial navigation and dead reckoning. Celestial navigation uses observations of the sun, moon, stars, or planets to calculate position. Dead reckoning begins with a known location, then estimates the new position using speed, time, direction, and wind. Both methods can work extremely well, but both become vulnerable when weather prevents observations or when small errors accumulate. Howland Island presented a special problem because it was so small. A navigator could calculate a line showing where the aircraft should be, yet still not know exactly where along that line it was located. That appears to be the meaning of Earhart's final reference to the line 157 to 337. Noonan may have taken a sunrise observation and calculated a line of position. If the aircraft reached that line but could not see Howland, Earhart could fly northwest and southeast along it, hoping to cross the island or find the Itasca's smoke. But a line is not a point. If they were north or south of Howland, they could fly along the correct line and still miss the island completely. The problem became even worse because Howland rose only slightly above sea level. Sun glare could make the island difficult to see. Cloud banks and haze could hide it. The Itasca produced smoke, but whether Earhart ever saw that smoke remains unknown. No confirmed visual sighting of the Electra was made from the ship or the island. The radio signal suggested the aircraft was close. But close across the Pacific could still mean many miles. Noonan's navigation may have brought them remarkably near the target. Near was not enough. The aircraft required a precise position before the fuel disappeared, and that precise position depended partly on radio direction finding. That is where the situation became chaotic. Earhart transmitted on different frequencies during the day and night. The Itasca attempted to contact her using voice, Morse code, and direction-finding signals. But Earhart was not skilled in Morse code. Her aircraft's radio equipment and antenna configuration created limitations. The frequencies being used were not ideal for every direction-finding system involved. Earhart could transmit to the Itasca. The ship heard her increasingly strong signals as she approached, but she repeatedly indicated that she could not hear the ship. This created a one-way conversation during the most important part of the flight. The Itasca called. Earhart continued speaking as though no answer had arrived. The ship transmitted on the frequency she requested. She reported receiving a signal, but she could not obtain the minimum needed for a useful bearing. Some researchers believe the aircraft's receiving system had failed. Others suggest the problem involved frequency confusion, equipment limitations, antenna design, or misunderstanding between Earhart and the Itasca operators. Whatever the precise cause, the result was disastrous. Earhart could not use the ship's transmissions to guide herself toward Howland. The Itasca could not ask her for all the information needed to calculate her position. The aircraft's radio signal grew strong enough to suggest proximity, but without two-way communication, the ship could not convert that strength into a rescue. At 7:42 in the morning, Earhart reported that they should be over the island, but could not see it. She said fuel was running low. At 7:58, she reported circling and asked the Itasca to transmit for a bearing. At approximately 8 o'clock, she said she had received the signal but could not obtain a minimum. Then came the final message at 8:43. They were on the line 157 to 337. They were running north and south. The signal was excellent. Then there was silence, the log records growing concern aboard the ship. Operators believed the aircraft was near. They repeatedly attempted to make contact. They watched the sky. They created smoke. But no aircraft appeared. By 9 o'clock, the shore party returned to the ship. At 10:40, the Itasca concluded that the aircraft was probably down and began searching. Earhart's final transmissions contain no mention of landing on an island. They contain no report of capture. They contain no description of mechanical failure. Instead, they describe the most basic aviation emergency imaginable. A pilot cannot find the destination. The pilot cannot establish reliable two-way communication. The fuel supply is decreasing. That is why the crash and sink theory remains so powerful. It does not require a hidden event after the last message. It follows directly from the information Earhart herself transmitted, yet one detail continues to support the alternative Nikumaroro theory. The line 157 to 337 did not point only toward Howland. If Earhart and Noonan followed that line southeast, they would move generally toward the Phoenix Islands. One of those islands was Gardner Island, now called Nikumaroro. Could they have continued along the line, found the island, and landed on its reef? The answer depends on fuel, distance, weather, navigation, and what happened after the final transmission. Before examining that theory, we must follow the immediate search. because the response to Earhart's disappearance was enormous. The Itasca searched the waters around Howland Island. Aircraft and ships examined large areas of the Central Pacific. The United States Navy eventually committed major resources, including the battleship Colorado and the aircraft carrier Lexington. Search aircraft flew over islands and reefs. Ships scanned the ocean. Radio operators listened for messages. The search continued for more than 2 weeks. No confirmed wreckage appeared. No oil slick was identified. No life raft was found. No verified remains were recovered. The Colorado sent aircraft to inspect islands southeast of Howland, including Gardner Island. The pilots reported signs of previous habitation on some islands, but no definite evidence of Earhart or Noonan. Supporters of the Nikumaroro theory argue that aircraft circling Gardner may have failed to see the castaways. Skeptics respond that no distress signal, camp, aircraft wreckage, or human activity was reported. The search eventually concentrated north and west of Howland, based on the assumption that Earhart had run out of fuel near her intended destination. On July 18th, the Lexington ended its search. The official effort had failed. Earhart and Noonan were declared missing. The mystery began almost immediately. But the simplest theory was also the first. The Electra had fallen into the sea. The crash and sink theory begins with the final confirmed evidence. Earhart believed she was near Howland. Her radio signal was strong. She said fuel was running low. She could not obtain a useful bearing. She could not see the island. The aircraft then disappeared. The most direct conclusion is that Earhart continued searching until the fuel was exhausted, then attempted to ditch or lost control over the ocean. This theory explains why no later confirmed message exists. An aircraft floating in the open Pacific might sink rapidly. If the Electra struck the water violently, its antennas and radio system would be destroyed immediately. The water near Howland is deep enough to hide the wreckage from 20th century searches. Modern undersea expeditions have examined large sections of the seafloor without locating the aircraft, but the possible search zone remains enormous. In 2024, a private company announced that a sonar image near Howland appeared to show an aircraft-shaped object. The image generated worldwide excitement. When the team returned to investigate, the target proved to be a natural rock formation. The episode demonstrated both the potential and the danger of underwater searches. At great depth, sonar shadows can resemble wings, tails, or fuselages. An exciting shape is not an identification. The crash and sink theory also has weaknesses. No confirmed piece of the Electra has been recovered. No debris field has been photographed, and some researchers argue that Earhart may have carried enough reserve fuel to continue southeast after missing Howland. The theory remains the leading explanation because it fits the final radio log with the fewest additional assumptions. But it has not been physically proven. Without wreckage, it remains a conclusion based on probability. That uncertainty allowed another possibility to grow. Perhaps Earhart did not fall into deep water. Perhaps she reached land. Nikumaroro is a remote coral atoll southeast of Howland Island. In 1937, it was known as Gardner Island. It lies near the southeast direction of the 157 to 337 line reported by Earhart. The central claim of the Castaway theory is that Earhart and Noonan followed that line after failing to find Howland. They eventually reached Nikumaroro. They landed the Electra on the broad reef surface during low tide. For several days, the aircraft remained capable of transmitting while its engine powered the radio. Then tides and waves dragged it over the reef edge or into the lagoon. Earhart and Noonan died as castaways before rescuers recognized their location. The most visually dramatic evidence is not a recovered aircraft part, but a photograph. In October 1937, a British colonial officer named Eric Bevington photographed the shoreline of Gardner Island. Decades later, researchers enlarged a tiny object near the reef edge. Some interpreted it as landing gear from a Lockheed Electra. Critics argue that the image is too indistinct to identify and may show ordinary reef debris. Then there is the Taraya object, a shape visible in satellite and historical imagery inside the Nikumaroro Lagoon, has been proposed as possible aircraft wreckage. Purdue Research Foundation and the Archaeological Legacy Institute have announced a 2026 expedition intended to inspect the object using imaging, sonar, magnetometers, and underwater excavation. Until the object is examined, it remains an anomaly rather than evidence. The Nikumaroro theory is attractive because it provides a complete narrative. The aircraft reaches land. The post-loss signals become possible. The missing wreckage is moved by the sea. The flyers survive temporarily. But a complete story is not necessarily a proven story. Every part of the reconstruction must be tested against the evidence, and the most controversial part involves the radio calls. After Earhart disappeared, radio operators and private listeners reported hearing signals believed to come from her aircraft. Some messages were incomplete, some were unintelligible, some clearly came from hoaxers. Others included phrases that listeners interpreted as distress calls. A teenager in Florida named Betty Klink wrote notes while listening to a voice she believed was Earhart. Her notebook describes a woman in distress, a man who may have been injured, rising water, and an increasingly desperate situation. If any genuine post-loss transmission came from Earhart, the crash and sink theory becomes much less likely. The Electra's radio could not transmit effectively from deep underwater. A functioning transmission would suggest the aircraft remained on land or on a reef with an engine capable of powering the equipment. Researchers supporting the Nikumaroro theory have cataloged reported signals and attempted to match reception conditions with times when the reef near the island was exposed. They argue that some direction-finding bearings and credible reports are consistent with a source near Nikumaroro. The problem is verification. Many alleged calls were never recorded. The surviving evidence often consists of handwritten notes, later testimony, and station reports, whose accuracy is difficult to establish. The Coast Guard investigated reported signals, but never obtained a confirmed two-way exchange with Earhart. No message produced coordinates that led rescuers to the Electra. The post-loss signals therefore occupy an uncomfortable position. They are too numerous to dismiss casually, but they are too uncertain to prove that Earhart reached Nikumaroro. They strengthen the Castaway theory only if their source can be authenticated. So far, that has not happened. In 1940, human remains were discovered on Gardner Island. A British colonial officer reported finding part of a skeleton near signs of a campsite. The recovered bones were sent to Fiji, where a doctor examined them. He concluded that they most likely belonged to a stocky adult male. The bones later disappeared. Only the original measurements survived. Decades later, researchers reanalyzed those measurements using modern forensic methods. Some concluded that the proportions could be consistent with Amelia Earhart. Other specialists criticized the methods and argued that measurements from an incomplete skeleton cannot establish identity. Because the bones are missing, DNA testing is impossible unless they are rediscovered. The campsite also produced artifacts. Researchers found glass bottles, a fragment interpreted as part of a cosmetic container, pieces of shoes, a sextant box, fish and bird remains, and evidence that someone had attempted to survive there. Some objects date broadly to the 1930s. Some resemble products Earhart might have used, but the island later held a settlement, a colonial work camp, and visitors who left material behind. A bottle from the correct decade does not prove ownership. A shoe fragment does not identify the wearer. An aluminum panel once promoted as possible, Electra skin was later challenged on technical grounds and may have come from another aircraft or structure. The strongest possible discovery would be a component carrying a serial number linked to Earhart's Electra. No such object has been publicly verified. The Castaway theory remains plausible because geography, reported signals, and island evidence can be arranged into a consistent scenario. But the chain contains weak links. And until aircraft wreckage or identifiable human remains are recovered, the theory cannot close the case. The most dramatic theory claims that Earhart and Noonan landed or crashed in the Marshall Islands. Japanese forces captured them. They were taken to Saipan and died in custody. Some versions suggest Earhart was secretly gathering intelligence for the United States. The theory is supported mainly by later witness accounts, island stories, and disputed documents. People recalled seeing a white woman, a white man, prisoners or an aircraft under Japanese control. But many accounts emerged decades after the disappearance. Memories changed, stories influenced one another, locations and dates conflicted. The greatest publicity came from a photograph found in the United States National Archives. The image showed people at Jaluit Harbor. A figure seated near the water was claimed to be Earhart. A standing man was claimed to be Noonan. An object on a barge was interpreted as the Electra. The photograph became the centerpiece of a television documentary. Then researchers found the same image in a Japanese publication dated 1935. That was 2 years before Earhart disappeared. The photograph could not show her after the final flight. This failure is important because it demonstrates how the desire to solve a mystery can turn an ambiguous image into apparently powerful evidence. The Japanese capture theory also struggles with geography. The Marshall Islands lay far from the route toward Howland, and in a direction difficult to reconcile with Earhart's final reported line of position. A major secret involving capture, transport, imprisonment, aircraft recovery, and execution would require many participants and records. No verified Japanese document confirms such an operation. No authenticated prison record identifies Earhart or Noonan, but compared with Crash and Sink, or Nikumaroro, it requires the greatest number of unsupported events. It is the weakest of the 3 major explanations. The search for Earhart did not end in 1937. Explorers have scanned the deep ocean near Howland. Archaeologists have repeatedly searched Nikumaroro. Researchers have examined photographs, radio bearings, bones, bottles, aircraft panels, eyewitness accounts, colonial files, Navy records, and satellite images. A sonar survey can examine one area perfectly while the aircraft lies outside it. An island excavation can uncover evidence of human survival without proving that the survivor was Earhart. A satellite image can reveal an unusual shape without identifying its material. The planned 2026 investigation of the Taraya object is therefore important, but its meaning depends entirely on what the team finds. If the object contains identifiable Electra components, the mystery could change overnight. If it is coral, vegetation, unrelated metal, or natural debris, the search will continue. Previous announcements should make us cautious. The 2024 aircraft-shaped sonar target near Howland became a rock. The Jaluit photograph became a pre-1937 harbor image. Other supposed breakthroughs faded when examined closely. The Earhart mystery repeatedly rewards excitement before delivering certainty. That does not mean new searches are pointless. It means every claim must survive physical verification. Until then, the absence of evidence remains the defining feature of the case. What really happened to Amelia Earhart? The surviving evidence supports one conclusion more strongly than the others. Earhart and Noonan reached the region of Howland Island after a long and difficult flight. They could not see the island. They could not establish reliable two-way radio communication. They were uncertain of their position. Their fuel was running low. The final confirmed message reported a line of position and a north-south search. Then the aircraft disappeared. The crash and sink theory follows directly from those facts. It requires no secret capture and no unconfirmed island landing. For that reason, it remains the most likely explanation. But likely is not the same as proven. The Nikumaroro theory is the strongest alternative. The island lies along a possible southeast extension of the reported line. Some radio reports, historical photographs, artifacts, and human remains can be interpreted as supporting a castaway scenario. Yet no verified Electra wreckage or Earhart DNA has been recovered. The Japanese capture theory is dramatic, but poorly supported. Its most famous photograph was taken before the disappearance, and no authenticated record confirms the capture. The honest verdict is therefore unequal. Crash and sink is most probable. Nikumaroro remains possible. Capture by Japan is unlikely. Why, then, does the mystery survive? Because probability does not satisfy the human need for an ending. Until one of those discoveries is made, Amelia Earhart's final flight will remain suspended between history and legend. The last confirmed evidence is not a wreckage field. It is a voice, a pilot searching for an island she could not see. a navigator trying to turn the rising sun into a position, a ship hearing them clearly but unable to guide them home. Then silence. And perhaps the reason Amelia Earhart was never found is the same reason her story still terrifies us. A person can come incredibly close to safety and still disappear.